I never thought that at the age of 71, after a lifetime in the silk and wine trade, I would be trembling in my own home. I am Alphonse, and if you believe that filial piety is always sincere, then my story will make you shiver with realization. Everything started to collapse when I touched the back door lock. Under the dim flashlight, fresh, bright scratches on the old brass appeared like a warning from hell. Someone had tried to break in, or more disgustingly, they already had a key, but wanted to sow fear in the heart of an old man who was slowly losing his mind like me. Just then, Seraphine, the new neighbor who moved in with mysterious behavior, appeared like a ghost in the mist of Annecy. Without any social greeting, she thrust a sealed envelope into my hand, her voice as cold as ice. Don't open it before 0 hours 15 minutes in the morning. And tonight, no matter what terrifying thing you see outside, absolutely do not leave the house. Why did I have to hide in my own villa? And the premium brain supplement that my son, Baudouin, forced me to drink every day. Was it a miracle drug or a slow death sentence to seize the massive fortune? If you want to know the cruel truth behind the mask of a filial son and the secret that my late wife hid to protect us, stay until the last second, because sometimes the person who wants to kill you the most is the one who smiles while giving you medicine. The blade of my silver paring knife moved with a precision that was slowly becoming a lie. I was 71, a man who had built a fortune importing the finest silks from Lyon and the most guarded vintages from Bordeaux. Yet here I was, struggling to carve a simple apple into the shape of a rabbit for a 6-year-old boy. My hands, which had once felt the microscopic imperfections in a bolt of premium silk, now felt heavy, like they were submerged in cold oil. "Are they ready, Grandpa Alphonse?" Leandre's voice drifted from the kitchen doorway, small and hopeful. I looked at him, my grandson, the only pulse of life left in this cavernous villa in Annecy. He stood there in his rocket ship pajamas, his dark hair a chaotic mess on one side, his eyes blinking against the morning light that reflected off the lake. Behind him, the French Alps stood like silent, jagged sentinels, watching over a home that felt more like a mausoleum every day. Almost mon petit. I forced a smile, my heart aching as I placed 2 wedges of fruit on a porcelain plate. 2 rabbits today. He climbed into his chair, but he didn't sit in the center. He sat at a sharp angle, away from the window, away from the empty chair at the head of the table. That chair had belonged to Olympe. She had been gone since January, taken by a cancer so aggressive. It felt like an assassination. Every morning, I still set a cup of Earl Grey at her place. I didn't drink it. I just let the steam rise like a fading memory until the liquid went cold and bitter. I turned back to the stove to pour Leandre's juice, and for a second, the world tilted. A sudden, violent surge of vertigo slammed into my skull. My vision blurred, the white tiles of the kitchen floor swirling into a dizzying vortex. I gripped the edge of the marble countertop until my knuckles turned white. "It's just age, Alphonse," I told myself, just the weight of the silence. Then I heard it, the low, predatory growl of a high-performance engine echoing up the driveway. I didn't need to look out the window to know it was Baudouin. My son didn't visit, he made appearances. He drove a black sedan that was always disturbingly clean, the kind of car that didn't just transport a man, it announced his arrival with the cold authority of a debt collector. The front door opened before I could reach it. Baudouin stepped in, smelling of expensive cologne and the metallic scent of rain. He was 38, wearing a suit that cost more than most men made in a year, and his smile never quite reached his eyes that were constantly scanning, taking inventory of the silver, the paintings, the very air we breathed. "Father," he said, pulling me into a brief, stiff embrace, "you look tired. Are you sleeping at all?" "I'm fine, Baudouin," I lied, my voice sounding thin even to my own ears. "Are you?" He walked into the kitchen and set a heavy glass bottle on the counter. The label was minimalist, expensive-looking, premium cognitive support. I've told you a dozen times, at 71, you can't manage this estate and a child alone. Olymp would be horrified to see you like this. You're fading, Dad. Everyone sees it. His words felt like a physical blow. I am managing, I snapped, though my hand trembled as I reached for a glass. Take these, he commanded, his voice dropping to a low, rhythmic hum that felt like a needle under the skin. 1 in the morning, 1 at night. I spent a fortune on these supplements. They're designed to stop the rot, Father. Unless, of course, you'd rather the court decide you're no longer fit to hold Leandre's hand. The threat was naked, shivering in the air between us. I looked at the bottle. It felt cold. I looked at Leandre, who had gone unnaturally still at the table, his eyes fixed on his plate, his small shoulders hunched as if expecting a storm. I'll take them, I whispered. After Baudouin left, the house felt even colder. That afternoon, I found myself standing in the upstairs hallway, staring at a portrait of Olymp. I stood there for 10 minutes, my mind a complete blank. I couldn't remember why I had come upstairs. I couldn't remember if I had eaten lunch. A cold, oily dread began to seep into my chest. The climax of my confusion hit at dinner. I was standing at the stove when the smell of gas reached me, thick, suffocating. I looked down. The burner was clicking, a rhythmic metallic sound, but there was no flame. I had left the gas on for God knows how long. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. Grandpa. Leandre was standing by the door, his face pale. The stove is making the loud noise again, like yesterday. Yesterday, I gasped, turning the knob with shaking fingers. I didn't. You did, he whispered, and Papa said that if you keep forgetting, the strangers will come and take me. He said, the judge has a big hammer, and he'll send me to a house with no windows. The sheer cruelty of the statement shattered the fog in my mind for a brief, crystalline second. He said what? Leandre started to cry, not the loud, boisterous cry of a child who skinned a knee, but a quiet, exhausted sob that broke my heart into 1,000 jagged pieces. I knelt down and pulled him to my chest. He was trembling so hard I thought his small frame might snap. He comes at night, Grandpa, Leandre whimpered into my shoulder, his voice a jagged sliver of terror, when you're in the deep sleep. He whispers in my ear. He says your brain is breaking and that I have to be a brave soldier and get ready to leave. My blood turned to ice. Baudouin was coming into my house at night while I was drugged into a stupor by his vitamins. I held the boy tighter, my eyes roaming the kitchen, looking for any sign of an intruder. That was when I saw it. I walked to the back door, the one I had locked myself. I ran my thumb along the deadbolt housing. My breath hitched. There were fresh, raw scratches along the lower edge of the lock, new metal weeping through the old finish. It wasn't the mark of a burglar. It was the mark of someone testing the boundaries, someone who already had a key, but wanted to see if I was still capable of noticing a breach. I stood there in the dying light of the anisey sunset, the scratches on the lock feeling like claws against my own skin. My son wasn't just waiting for me to die. He was actively dismantling my reality, brick by brick, pill by pill. I looked out the window toward the end of the long, winding drive. Under the shadow of a massive sycamore tree, a figure stood. It wasn't Baudouin. It was a silhouette, unmoving, watching the villa with a terrifying, singular focus. The fog in my head tried to swallow me again, a heavy grey tide of confusion, but I fought it. I reached into my pocket and felt the weight of the silver paring knife I had forgotten to put away. "He's not taking you, Leandre," I hissed, the words tasting like copper in my mouth. "I don't care what my brain is doing. I am Alphonse, and I am still the master of this house." But as the moon rose over the lake, casting long skeletal shadows across the floor, I realized with a jolt of pure horror that the predator wasn't just at the gates. He was already in my bloodstream. The doorbell rang. It was 11 p.m. I shouldn't have answered it, but I did. Standing on the porch was a woman I had only seen from a distance, the new neighbor, Seraphine. She didn't look like a grandmother, she looked like a hawk. She thrust a sealed cream-colored envelope into my hand. "Do not open this until 0 Fin," she said, her voice a low, commanding rasp. "And whatever you hear outside tonight, Alphonse, whatever screams or shadows you see, absolutely do not leave this house. Do you understand? Your life depends on staying behind that door." She turned and vanished into the darkness before I could speak. I stood in the foyer, the envelope feeling like a lead weight in my hand. Behind me, the stove began to click again. Or was it just in my head? I looked at the lock. I looked at the dark lake. The war for my soul, my grandson, and my sanity had just begun. The silence in the villa was no longer peaceful. It had become a predatory weight. It pressed against my chest, thick and suffocating, amplified by the heavy, oily fog that Bordeaux supplements had settled into my brain. Every night, the routine was the same. I would swallow the 2 capsules, feeling the chemical coldness slide down my throat, and wait for the world to tilt. My limbs would grow leaden, my thoughts fraying at the edges like old silk left too long in the sun. But tonight the fog was pierced by a sound that bypassed my drugged senses and struck straight at my soul. It was a scream, hollow, jagged, and soaked in a terror too deep for a 6-year-old boy. "Leandre," I gasped, my voice sounding like gravel. I fought the lethargy, my muscles screaming in protest as I forced myself out of bed. The hallway between our rooms, a stretch of floor I had walked 1,000 times, felt like a miles-long gauntlet. My vision swam, the walls of the corridor pulsing in the moonlight, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. I pushed his door open. The star-shaped nightlight cast a pale, sickly gold glow over the room. Leandre was huddled in the corner of his bed, his small frame shaking so violently that the wooden headboard rattled against the wall. He was clutching his stuffed lion as if it were the only thing keeping him from falling into an abyss. "I'm here, Petty. I'm here," I whispered, sitting on the edge of the mattress. I reached out to touch his back, but he flinched, a sharp, instinctive recoil that felt like a knife to my ribs. "Grandpa." His voice was a thin sliver of glass. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and fixed on the window. "Is he gone? Did he go back into the shadows?" My blood ran cold. "Who, Leandre? It was just a nightmare. No one is here but us." He turned to me then, and the look in his eyes wasn't the confusion of a child waking from a dream. It was the haunted, hollowed-out stare of a survivor. He leaned in, his breath smelling of the warm milk I'd given him earlier, and lowered his voice to a terrified whimper. "Papa comes when you're in the deep sleep, Grandpa. He doesn't knock, he just appears." The room seemed to shrink. "Bordeaux, he comes here at night. How?" "He has a key that makes no noise," Leandre whispered, his tears carving tracks through the sweat on his face. "He sits on the edge of my bed. He smells like that cold metal and the rain. He told me it's our special time. He told me that if I wake you up, your brain will finally break for good," he said. "The judge in the city is waiting with a big iron hammer to take me away to the orphanage, a house with no windows where no one will ever find me." The revelation was a physical blow. My own son, the boy I had raised with every ounce of my merchant's discipline and a father's love, was gaslighting a 6-year-old in the dead of night. He was using the boy's love for me as a weapon, a leash to keep him silent while he slowly dismantled my sanity. "He said you're confused, Grandpa," Leandre sobbed, clutching my sleeve with white-knuckled desperation. "He said you're forgetful and dangerous, and if I don't help him protect the family business, the police will come for you. Please, don't let them take me. Don't let him come back tonight." "He is not taking you," I hissed, the words tasting like copper. "I am the master of this house, Leandre. I am Alphonse, and I will burn this entire valley to the ground before I let him touch a hair on your head." I stayed with him until his breathing evened out into an exhausted, fitful sleep, but my own mind was a storm. The confusion Baudouin had mentioned, it wasn't age, it was a calculated, chemical execution. Every pill he gave me was a brick in the wall he was building around my life. I went downstairs, moving through the dark kitchen without turning on the lights. I needed to see. I needed to know. I walked to the back door, the heavy oak entrance that led to the gardens. I had personally overseen the installation of the locks years ago, solid reinforced brass. I knelt, running my thumb along the metal plate, my heart hammered against my ribs. There, under the pale moonlight filtering through the glass, were fresh, raw scratches. They weren't deep enough to be a forced entry. They were the marks of a man testing his access, perhaps a key that didn't quite fit, or a tool used to ensure the bolt was sliding smoothly without my knowledge. It was a violation so intimate it made me want to retch. Baudouin wasn't just visiting, he was patrolling his future conquest. I stood there, staring at the lock, when a movement outside caught my eye. At the far end of the property, near the old stone wall that separated my land from the lake, a figure was standing, a silhouette unmoving, draped in the shadows of the cypress trees. It wasn't Baudouin. This shape was broader, more patient. It was watching the house with a terrifying, singular focus. Suddenly, a sharp, insistent knock at the front door made me jump. I checked the clock on the mantel, 10:45 p.m. I grabbed a heavy silver letter opener from the sideboard, the only weapon I had, and approached the door. I pulled it open just an inch. Standing there was Seraphine. She looked different than she had in the afternoon. Her silver hair was pulled back tightly, and her eyes, usually sharp, were now two burning coals of urgency. She didn't offer a greeting. She didn't smile. "Alphonse," she said, her voice a low, commanding rasp that demanded obedience. "You are being hunted in your own home. Do you understand that yet?" "My son," I started, but she cut me off with a flick of her hand. "Your son is a predator who has forgotten that he was once the prey," she said. She reached into the pocket of her wool coat and thrust a heavy, cream-colored envelope into my hand. It was sealed with wax, unmarked. "What is this?" I asked, my fingers trembling as I gripped the paper. "This is your lifeline," she replied, stepping closer until I could see the cold, professional steel in her gaze, the look of a woman who had spent decades sentencing men far worse than Baudouin. "Listen to me very carefully. Do not open this until 0:50 a.m., not a minute sooner. And tonight, Alphonse, regardless of what you hear outside, regardless of the screams, the shadows, or the sound of footsteps on your porch, you do not leave this house. Seraphine, talk to me. Who is that man by the lake? Trust the process, not your impulses," she hissed, her voice cutting through my panic. "The man you see is a sentinel, not an assassin, but the danger inside these walls is much closer than the one outside. Stay behind the door, Alphonse. The clock is ticking, and the truth is coming for you." She turned and vanished into the midnight mist of Annecy before I could utter another word. I retreated into the living room, the envelope feeling like a lead weight in my palm. I sat in my armchair, the house creaking around me like a ship lost at sea. I didn't turn on the lights. I didn't move. I watched the minute hand of the grandfather clock crawl across the face with agonizing slowness. Baudouin thought I was a senile old merchant, a relic to be discarded and liquidated. He thought he could poison my blood and steal my legacy while I smiled and thanked him for the vitamins. But as I sat there in the dark, the envelope resting on my lap, the fog in my mind began to lift, replaced by a cold, mercantile fury. If he wanted a war for this house, for Leandre, for the soul of our family, I would give him one. The silence was broken by a low, metallic thud from the back of the house. Someone was at the door. Someone was testing the lock. I gripped the envelope, my knuckles white. At 0:15 a.m. precisely, I broke the wax seal. The high-tension game was over. The counter-offensive had begun. The grandfather clock in the foyer didn't just tick. It struck the silence like a hammer against a cold anvil. Each second was a heartbeat of pure, unadulterated dread. I sat in the darkness of my study, the heavy velvet curtains drawn tight, clutching the cream-colored envelope Seraphine had thrust upon me. My mind was a battlefield. One half was clouded by the chemical sludge Baudouin had been feeding me, whispering that I was old, senile, and paranoid. The other half, the merchant who had spent 40 years reading the hidden motives of silk traders in Lyon, was screaming that a noose was tightening around my neck. I stood up, my knees popping like dry twigs. I moved to the window with the practiced stealth of a man who had once navigated midnight warehouses to inspect a shipment of smuggled spice. I parted the linen curtain just a fraction. The moonlight turned the gardens of my Annecy villa into a landscape of silver and bone, and there he was. A massive, dark-clad figure stepped out from the shadow of the cypress trees. He didn't move like a common thief. A thief is frantic, darting, looking for a weakness to exploit. This man moved with a terrifying, rhythmic precision. He walked the perimeter of my back fence, paused to scan the upper windows, Leandre's room specifically, and then continued. He checked the hinges on the gate. He tested the air. He wasn't looking for a way in. He was checking to ensure no one else had gotten there first. "Who are you?" I hissed under my breath, my fingers digging into the fabric of the curtain. "And who the hell is paying you to watch me rot?" Before I could sink back into the shadows, the man stopped. He looked directly at my window. Even in the dark, his gaze felt like a physical weight, a beam of cold light pinning me to the floor. Then he did something that chilled me to the marrow. He gave a single, sharp nod, a professional acknowledgement from one soldier to another, and vanished into the mist. A sharp rap on the side door made me nearly jump out of my skin. "Alphonse, it's time, move," a voice rasped. "Seraphine." I didn't think. I didn't question. I grabbed my coat and slipped out into the freezing night air. We crossed the shared lawn like two criminals, the grass crunching under our boots. She led me into her house, but we didn't stop in the living room. She marched me straight into a back office that smelled of old parchment, leather-bound law books, and the metallic tang of a cold engine. Seraphine turned on a single desk lamp. The light carved deep, jagged shadows into her face, making her look less like a neighbor and more like an executioner. "Sit," she commanded. I sat. Across from me sat the giant I had seen outside. Up close, he was a mountain of a man with hands that looked like they could crush a wine cask with a single squeeze. "Alphonse, meet Théophane," Seraphine said, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "He's a specialist in high-threat security. He's been patrolling your perimeter since the spring, and he's the only reason Baudouin hasn't finished the job yet." "What job?" I growled, my mercantile fury finally boiling over. "My son is a businessman. He's ambitious, yes, maybe even a little cold, but he's dawning on my doorstep with vitamins and—" "Vitamins." Seraphine let out a short, bark-like laugh that was devoid of any humor. "Alphonse, don't be a fool. Baudouin isn't giving you supplements. He's conducting chemical warfare on your nervous system. He's been poisoning you for 8 months to simulate cognitive collapse. He needs you declared legally incompetent, so he can seize the silk accounts and the trust fund meant for Leandre." The air in the room felt like it had been sucked out. "That's impossible. He's my blood." "Blood is just a liquid that carries toxins, Alphonse." Théophane spoke for the first time. His voice was a low, industrial rumble. "I've watched him. I've tracked his routes. He doesn't come here to check on you. He comes here to calibrate your decline. He's been building a file on you, documented incidents of your confusion, to present to a judge." "Why are you telling me this now?" I demanded, my voice shaking. "And why are you here? You're a neighbor I met 2 weeks ago." Seraphine leaned forward, her eyes burning. "I didn't move here by accident, Alphonse. I was a family court judge for 22 years. 11 years ago, your son Baudouin stood before my bench. He had defrauded a widow of her entire life savings through a series of structured investments. He walked free because of a lack of evidence, but I never forgot that predator's smile. She paused, her expression softening into something infinitely more painful. And I'm here because of Olymp. The mention of my late wife's name felt like a physical blow to the chest. Olymp, she's been gone for months. What does she have to do with this? She knew, Theophan said quietly. Olymp wasn't just a pianist, she was a strategist. 3 years ago, she saw the signs. She saw how Baudouin looked at your ledgers. She saw the way he spoke to Leandre when he thought no one was listening. She realized her son was a sociopath. She met me through a volunteer group, Theophan continued. We spent months in the cab of a cargo van, delivering food to the poor. She told me everything. She knew the cancer was going to take her before she could stop him, so she made a deal. She used her own private savings, money you didn't even know she had, to hire us. She paid for your protection from beyond the grave, I whispered, tears stinging my eyes. She knew you, Alphonse, Seraphine said, her voice dropping to a whisper. She said, Alphonse will go straight to Baudouin the moment he suspects something. That's who he is. But this time, confronting him directly will get him killed. She was protecting you, right up to her final breath. Theophane reached into his heavy canvas jacket and pulled out a small, black USB drive. It was unremarkable, the kind of thing you'd see at any checkout counter, but it had a small piece of white tape on the side, with 2 letters written in a handwriting I would know in any lifetime, AD. My initials, written by Olympe. She told me not to give this to you until it was a matter of life or death, Theophan said, sliding the drive across the mahogany desk. Until Baudouin did something you couldn't explain away. The guardianship petition he filed this morning. That was the trigger. I picked up the drive. It weighed nothing, yet it felt like it carried the mass of a planet. What's on here? I asked. The truth, Seraphine replied. Olympe spent her final months recording his phone calls. She screenshotted his search history on the family laptop, searches for synthetic compounds that cause memory loss. She even found the lawyer he was using to forge her will. Forged her will, I gasped. The version you saw in probate was a fake. Alphonse, Seraphine said, her eyes turning back into cold steel. The real one, the one Olympe filed in a different county, expressly forbids Baudouin from ever being Leandre's guardian. It names you as the sole protector of the family assets. Baudouin intercepted the original process and replaced it with a lie. I gripped the USB drive until the edges bit into my palm. The chemical fog in my brain seemed to incinerate under a wave of pure, white-hot fury. This wasn't just greed. This was a calculated assassination of my dignity and my grandson's future. He's coming tomorrow, I said, my voice sounding like the grinding of stone. He's coming with more vitamins. Then we let him, Seraphine said, a lethal smile touching her lips. Theophan has installed high-definition cameras in your kitchen. We need the footage. We need to see him swap those bottles with our own eyes. Once we have that, we don't just stop him, we destroy him. Is it dangerous? I asked, looking at Theophan. The giant leaned back, his knuckles cracking. He's your son, but to me, he's just a target who hasn't realized he's already in the crosshairs. Do your job, Alphonse. Be the confused old man for one more day. I'll be in the shadows, and God help him if he tries to touch that boy. I stood up, the USB drive tucked into the inside pocket of my coat right over my heart. I looked at the 2 sentinels Olympe had left to guard my life. For the first time since January, the house didn't feel empty. The merchant is back, I said, my voice cold and final, and the price for betraying my family is a debt Baudouin will spend the rest of his life paying. The clinic in Lyon didn't smell like healing. It smelled like an ending. It was a cold, sterile box of white light and recycled air that seemed to vibrate with the low hum of the machines buried in its walls. I sat in a hard plastic chair, my hands clamped onto my knees to stop them from shaking. Beside me, Seraphine stood like a statue carved from flint, her eyes fixed on the door of the head toxicologist's office. Clovis, the federal tax inspector with the eyes of a hungry wolf, stepped out. He wasn't smiling. He held a manila folder as if it contained a live grenade. "Alphonse," he said, his voice a low, jagged rasp, "I need you to listen very carefully, and I need you to stay in that chair." I stood up anyway, the mercury in my veins, the leaden, oily fog that had been my constant companion for 8 months, seemed to surge. "Tell me, Clovis, stop treating me like a man with one foot in the grave." He opened the folder. The report inside was a map of my own betrayal. The lab found a synthetic compound in your blood. It's rare, expensive, and has absolutely no legitimate medical use. In small, consistent doses, it mimics the exact symptom profile of early-onset dementia. Forgetfulness, vertigo, word retrieval failure. He looked me dead in the eye. "It's a chemical assassination, Alphonse. Someone has been erasing your mind, one morning coffee at a time." The room didn't just tilt, it shattered. 8 months, I whispered, the number echoing the time since Baudouin had first walked into my kitchen with those premium supplements. My own son. He didn't just want my money. He wanted to bury me while I was still breathing. "It's premeditated," Clovis added, his voice hardening. "He didn't just stumble into this. He calculated the accumulation rate. He needed you to appear senile just in time for the guardianship hearing." We left the clinic and drove in a suffocating silence to a private room in the back of a legal archive. Theophan was already there, his massive frame dwarfing the desk where 2 sets of documents were laid out under a harsh lamp. "Olympe was a genius," Seraphine said, gesturing to the papers. "She knew he would try this. She knew his greed was a sickness that would eventually turn on you." I leaned over the desk, my vision blurring for a second before I forced it to focus. I saw the will Baudouin had presented to the probate court, the one that gave him full control of the Silk accounts and the €425,000 trust fund meant for Leandre. Then I saw the second document, the real one. "The signature on the version you received, it's a masterpiece of forgery," Seraphine explained, pointing with a silver pen. But he made one fatal mistake. He used a notary seal from an office that went bankrupt and closed 18 months ago. He was so focused on the ink and the handwriting that he forgot to check the history of the stamp. I traced the lines of Olympe's true will. In her sharp, elegant script, she had added a single devastating paragraph. "Prescott Allen Decker is expressly and irrevocably excluded from any guardianship or fiduciary role." This exclusion is made with full legal awareness and for reasons known to the undersigned. He killed her memory to rob his own son, I growled, the fury finally burning through the last of the chemical fog. He was going to leave Leandre with nothing but a house, with no windows, and a grandfather who couldn't remember his own name. A knock at the door made us all freeze. Theophan's hand went instinctively to the heavy tool belt at his waist. A woman stepped into the room. She was thin, her face drawn and pale, her eyes carrying a weight that no one should have to bear. "My name is Issei," she said, her voice trembling but clear, "and I've been waiting 4 years to see that look on your face, Alphonse." I remembered her. She was the brilliant editor who had disappeared from Baudouin's side years ago. We had heard rumors of a breakdown, a sudden departure. "I wasn't sick, Alphonse," Issei said, stepping into the light. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small recorder. "I was a prisoner. I recorded his calls because I knew that one day he would stop hitting me and start doing something much worse. I just didn't think he'd do it to his own father." She pressed play. Baudouin's voice filled the room. It wasn't the smooth, solicitous voice of the devoted son who brought me vitamins. It was a cold, predatory hiss. "The old man is slow," the recording played, Baudouin's voice sounding distorted but unmistakable. "He's already forgetting where he puts his keys. Another 3 months of the compound and he won't be able to tie his own shoes." By the time the judge sees him, he'll be a shell. The silk accounts, the lake house, the trust, it all flows to me, and the brat. Leandre is a lever. I'll use him to keep the old man compliant until the papers are signed. The recording continued, detailing a plan that had begun 4 years ago, the moment I had first reported him for the bruises I'd seen on Issei's arms. He's been mapping your psychological pressure points for half a decade, Issei whispered, her eyes fixed on the recorder as if it were a holy relic. He told me he'd take care of the family loyalties. He wanted to punish you for ever daring to stand in his way. He never loved that boy, I said, the realization hitting me like a physical blow. Leandre was never his son. He was just collateral. He's a man who builds grievances into a lifestyle, Theophan added, his voice a low rumble of disgust. He didn't just want the money. He wanted the total destruction of the man who tried to hold him accountable. I looked at the toxicology report. I looked at the forged will. I looked at Issei, who had risked everything to bring us the final piece of the puzzle. The man who had been my son was dead to me. In his place was a monster that I had inadvertently fed with my own loyalty and silence. "What now, Alphonse?" Clovis asked, his hand hovering over his phone. "The warrant is ready. We have the poisoning, the forgery, the financial fraud, and the recordings of his threats against a minor. We can end this tonight." I stood up, my spine straighter than it had been in months. The vertigo was gone, replaced by a crystalline, mercantile coldness. I thought of the scratches on my back door, the mark of a man testing his prey. I thought of Leandre crying in the dark, terrified of a judge with an iron hammer. "No," I said, my voice cutting through the room like a silk cutter's blade. "We don't end it in the dark. He wants a court hearing. He wants to prove I'm incompetent. We'll give him exactly what he wants, but he's going to walk into that room thinking he's the hunter, and he's going to realize he's already in the cage." I turned to Theophan. "Ensure the kitchen cameras are live. I want every second of him swapping those bottles on record. I want the world to see the moment he dabs the poison into his father's cup." I looked at Seraphine. "You were right. The truth is the only thing he can't buy or forge." I picked up the manila folder and tucked it under my arm. The silk merchant was gone, the master of the house was back, and the price for betraying my grandson was a debt Baudouin would be paying for the rest of his miserable life. "Check the time," I commanded. "The sun is going down. Let him come. Let him bring his vitamins. I've never been more ready to take my medicine." The air in my kitchen was heavy, thick with the scent of lavender and the metallic tang of an ending. I sat at the mahogany table, my hands, once the most precise tools in the silk trade, trembling with a forced fragility. It was a performance, the most critical transaction of my 71 years. I had to be the broken man. I had to be the senile Alphonse, the relic that Bordeaux was so eager to liquidate. Behind the spice rack, a tiny lens, no larger than a button, blinked with a cold red eye. Seraphine had adjusted it 10 degrees to the left, ensuring the entire length of the counter was in the frame. This was the kill zone. The back door opened without a knock. Baudouin walked in, his black leather shoes clicking with the predatory rhythm I had grown to loathe. He didn't look at me. He looked at the kitchen counter, specifically at the glass bottle of vitamins sitting next to my cold tea. "You look particularly grey today, Father," he said, his voice a smooth, oily caress that made my skin crawl. "Did you forget your morning dose again? I told you, the cognitive decay won't wait for your permission." I looked at him with glazed eyes, letting my jaw slacken just enough. "Olympe, she liked the morning light," I whispered, sounding as if I were chasing a memory that had already turned to dust. Baudouin let out a sharp, disgusted sigh. He moved to the counter. In the reflection of the toaster, I watched him. He reached into his silk-lined coat and pulled out a fresh bottle. With the unhurried, arrogant ease of a man who believed he had already won, he swapped them. He spent exactly 11 seconds on the exchange, dabbing a few drops of the synthetic compound into my open teacup for good measure. "Your brain is a rotting piece of fruit. Father," he hissed, leaning down until his cologne, the scent of cold rain and ambition, clogged my lungs. "I'm just here to prune the branches before the whole tree falls on Leandre. Drink your tea. Let the darkness take the wheel. It's easier that way." You're a good son, Baudouin," I croaked, my heart hammering against my ribs with a fury that nearly broke my cover. He didn't respond. He just smiled, that thin, self-contained sliver of a smile, and walked out, already calling for his assistant on his cell phone to discuss estate liquidations. I didn't drink the tea. The moment the door clicked shut, the senile old man vanished. I stood up, my spine a steel rod, and looked directly into the hidden camera. "We have it," I whispered. The vipers of Annecy were gathered at the Grand Palais for the summer charity gala. It was a sea of shimmering silk, expensive champagne, and louder lies. Baudouin was at the center of it, holding a flute of crystal, holding court like a king who had just inherited a kingdom of gold. He was laughing, telling a group of investors about his father's tragic decline and his plans to modernize the family's silk legacy. I stood in the shadows of the balcony, flanked by Théophane and Séraphine. Théophane looked like a mountain in a tuxedo, his hands folded in front of him, his eyes never leaving Baudouin. "Is the feed ready?" I asked. Clovis, the federal inspector, nodded from the tech booth. "The big screen is yours, Alphonse. Let's show them the true face of the devoted son." Suddenly, the music stopped. The ambient chatter of the elite died down as the massive projection screen behind the stage flickered to life. It wasn't a promotional video for Silk. The room went bone-chillingly silent as the footage played. There was Baudouin in high-definition clarity, nonchalantly swapping the bottles in my kitchen. The audio was crisp. "Your brain is a rotting piece of fruit, father. Drink your tea. Let the darkness take the wheel." The champagne flute slipped from Baudouin's hand, shattering on the marble floor with a sound like a gunshot. He turned white, the color of a fresh shroud. He looked around the room, seeing his peers, the people he had spent years trying to impress, recoiling from him as if he were a leper. "It's a lie," he screamed, his voice cracking. "That's a deep fake. My father is insane." The only insanity here, Baudouin was thinking. "I wouldn't fight back," I said, stepping into the light of the balcony. Clovis and 4 uniformed officers stepped out from the wings. The arrest was violent. Baudouin tried to run, knocking over a tray of hors d'oeuvre, but Théophane was faster. He intercepted him with a single, brutal tackle that sent Baudouin sprawling across the floor. The devoted son was hauled up, his expensive suit torn, his face pressed against the cold marble as the handcuffs ratcheted shut. "Baudouin Allen," Clovis barked, his voice echoing through the silent hall. "You are under arrest for intentional poisoning with premeditation, forgery of legal documents, and the psychological abuse of a minor." I watched them drag him out. He didn't look like a king anymore. He looked like a cornered rat, screaming obscenities until the doors slammed shut. The trial was a slow, agonizing surgical procedure. Each piece of evidence, the toxicology reports from Lyon, the forged will Olympe had hidden from him, the recordings from Issei, was a nail in the coffin of his freedom. The judge didn't flinch. She looked at Baudouin, who sat in the dock with a defiant, cold stare, and read the sentence that ended his world, 22 years. No early parole, no leniency for the man who tried to murder his father's mind. Spring, 1 year later. The tulips in the gardens of the villa were pushing through the soil, a vibrant, determined explosion of color against the backdrop of Lake Annecy. The water was a piercing, crystalline blue, the kind of color that made you believe the world had been scrubbed clean. I sat on the porch, a cup of real Earl Grey in my hand. My memory was sharp, the chemical fog entirely evaporated. I looked out at the lawn. Theophan was teaching Leandra how to skip stones across the water's edge. The boy's laugh was no longer guarded or thin. It was a loud, boisterous sound that carried the weight of a child who finally felt safe. Seraphine sat in the chair beside me, reading a law journal, her presence a steady, comforting anchor. I realized then that Olympe had been the ultimate merchant. She knew that blood could be poisoned, but she also knew that loyalty was a currency that never devalued. She had traded her secrets for the protection of these strangers, and in doing so, she had given me something more valuable than any silk empire. I had lost my son, but I had found a family, not one bound by the accidents of biology, but one forged in the fires of shared truth and silent vigils. Wealth is a poor shield against greed, but the kindness of strangers is a fortress for the soul. Never let the comfort of a familiar face blind you to the rot beneath the surface. Trust your instincts, for they are the echoes of those who truly love you, even from beyond the grave. Family isn't just who you share a name with, 3 family is who stays. Every family story deserves to be told. If this one reached you, leave a comment and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe so you never miss what comes next. We read every single one. Thank you for staying until the very end. A gentle reminder, upcoming stories contain some fictional elements crafted purely for reflection and awareness. If that's not your preference, feel free to step away and choose content that better suits you. No judgment. Thank you and see you the next video.